Hello, and welcome to the Your Killer Life podcast. I am your host, Tammy Grable-Woodford, and I am very excited today because I have my co-host with me, Griff Woodford, and he's going to be joining me at least on one podcast each month. And we really wanted to, at least I wanted to, we'll talk about what I was hoping from this, and then I'm going to toss it over and we're going to talk with him about how I roped him into it, but really wanted to make sure that we didn't just talk about things from the cancer perspective, but that we also talked about things from the caregiver perspective. And so today we're going to be talking about durability and resilience. And Griff, you want to tell us a little bit before we get started on that about why you're here and what your hopes and goals are for being here?
Well, certainly. So as I'm sure you guys have figured out by the last name, we are in fact married. So our relationship and our marriage over the past 5 years has offered us quite a few opportunities to improve in our durability and resilience. Not just cancer alone, obviously everything that goes along with that. So being the cohesive unit that we've been able to form, it's important to offer additional outlooks and additional paths to what has led us to be successful. So why I'm here is, again, how to be successful, and not so much in the monetary or the social aspect, but in the aspect that none of us get to get out of. That would be trauma. Every person faces some sort of trauma, life-altering trauma, throughout their existence, whether that's watching your cat run over when you're 6 years old to ongoing sexual abuse by a parent. Obviously, there's large degrees in variance between trauma, but everyone does experience it. So why I am here is to offer one of my aspects and outlooks on how to not just be successful during that period of trauma, but the aftermath of that trauma. And in my experience, the observed experience of others is it's often the aftermath of that trauma. Once the pain and the immediate pressure is off, then now what? Now how do we recover from that, and how do we go on to live a better life after that, as opposed to being mired in it? So that's why I'm here.
I so appreciate that. As you talk about trauma, I can actually feel my body tensing up. And I guess that's one of the gifts I think coming out of this is I'm so much more aware of my own response to stress. But it's interesting to me that still just words have that much impact and power.
Certainly.
So you talk about hard versus strong, and where does that idea come from, and how is it applicable to being successful in sort of, during trauma and then, of course, after trauma?
Well, the concept of hard versus strong is certainly not a new one. The difficulty that many of us face, and I would say in particular, there's more of a lean to it based on men. From very young age, we're conditioned both socially and biologically to be hard, as it were, to not show emotion, to get up, dust yourself off, and move on like nothing's happened. So where the differentiation comes in from me, and the point of the podcast in the first place, is actually from two different aspects. First, my personal aspect, and then also from military, my time in the military, and then also the correlating careers afterwards. So where to best describe the difference between being hard and being strong? As you obviously know, honey, I like knives. In particular, I like metallurgy. Behind the knives, why is it that a knife that looks the same, made of the same steel, and even has same geometry, why is one so much more capable than the other? Well, that comes down to effectively heat and pressure. So making a hard knife where hardness is categorized in metallurgy is its ability to resist abrasion, where a strong knife is measured in ductility, or its ability to absorb sudden and massive impact. So how does that knife become hard? How does that knife become strong? It comes down to heat and pressure. So we can associate that with a crucible is actually what the term is called. It's this large oven that applies heat and pressure to raw steel. So to create a hard knife, goes in the crucible, then it is immediately quenched. Once it's out, once it's reached that critical temperature, it is taken out and plunged into a quenching agent. A strong knife undergoes the exact same heat, the exact same pressure, but is left to sit. It is left to cool. It is left to stay in that heat until it is ready to be molded into something different. So the same applicability comes to us. I'm not going to necessarily differentiate between American, European, what have you. It's part of every culture. Not just men, but women as well, is as soon as we are out of that crucible, that we immediately move on to something else, get rid of that pain, get rid of that associated horror and terror of the crucible that we were just in, trauma, right? Mm-hmm. So it is bordering on unacceptable to just sit in it, to allow it to do what it is there to do, what trauma, what loss, what grief is there to actually do. That is to transcend fear. That is to strengthen us. So in practical application, what's the difference between a hard knife and a strong knife? Well, a hard knife, you can cut through a lot of things without having to reshape, without having to do anything to that blade, that edge, that geometry. You can cut and cut and cut and cut and cut. A strong knife is meant to absorb impacts. If a hard knife is subjected to the same force that a highly ductile knife is, it shatters. It becomes unusable. It cannot be remade. Whereas a strong knife can be subjected to immense impact, and sudden impact, repeated impact. And all that's necessary is to bend the blade back into shape and rehone it. Then it is the exact same knife when it started. So I think we can kind of get the idea of where I'm going with this, why hard is not applicable. There is so much less use, right? And that's what we all look for as people. We want to be useful to ourselves, useful to our spouse, our friends, the people that matter to us, society. If we focus on that hardness, being out of that pain, that crucible immediately after, whether that's through work, sex, alcohol, drugs, that may steel us to the cutting through life, but we will be subject to additional impacts. There's no way to get out of that. So when that does happen, now we become unmendable, as opposed to that strong knife, that strong person who, going through the same trauma, the same crucible, sits, allows it to do its work. When that's done, when that temperature reduces, when that pressure reduces naturally, we become so much more useful than a hard knife. The reason why we don't do that, right? I mean, it sounds like, well, this is the obvious answer. The reason that we don't is because it is unequivocally the worst pain a human being can feel. There's no comparison. You know, honey, you know the career choice that I had for my entire adult life subjected me to significant physical injury repeatedly. I can tell you that I would gladly and gleefully accept every single one of those physical injuries at the same time than what it felt like to lose Titus, my dog, for everyone who's watching. That's why we don't do it very often. And the thing of it is, too, is it's not something you can necessarily do alone either. So that's another aspect to be aware of. And I would say actually a really critical aspect to be aware of is the person going through that natural cooling process after this is, and I can speak from personal experience, the observed experience of others in this, is we don't want to be a burden to those around us.
Right.
We don't want to subject people that we love, we care for, that we're responsible for, to us not being able to function for specific period of time, whether it's a day or in one of my cases, nearly 4 months. That's another very large factor to this. So I'm referring to my notes so I don't go over. I mean, this is a topic that could be spoken on for hours and still not be really covered. But
it's interesting thinking about the framing of hard versus strong and durability and resilience, and thinking through, because breast cancer, any cancer, I'm sure, but I can only speak about breast cancer because that's my experience and what I know. But, we've talked about the 5 stages of grief and how, and loss, and how, you go through that initial loss of just hearing the news, and then you go through the loss with the mastectomies, and it's almost like you're constantly you're like a ping pong ball in a high velocity in a very small space with grief, bouncing back and forth between where it is you're supposed to be, because it's like every 3 months or every doctor appointment you're getting a different type of news, a different type of loss, something new to be angry about or in denial about, or just feeling like it's unjust. It's just maniacal in how it feels. And so do you think that, would you describe sort of that process as part of the, that interim cooling of?
Absolutely. That's exactly what the 5 stages of grief are. And in fact, it's interesting, and I did not include in my notes the actual name of this chemical, and you and I have talked about this before, is actually allowing, and not just allowing, but seeking out the stages of grief. There is a difference to that. Allowing is a sense of just kind of laying back and whatever happens, as opposed to being proactive in this process. So with that, the stages of grief are effectively designed around your psychological, emotional, and physiological response to trauma and to grief, and how those need to work together in order to actually be successful. It not just, I won't say in particular during trauma, that's when that sympathetic nervous system stuff's going on, that fight or flight mechanism. So you really don't have access to those things. But afterwards, that cooling down period, as it were, there's a chemical that's secreted in one place, only one place in the entire anatomy and physiology of a human being, that is directly correlated to the we'll just say getting through grief and loss, part of the acceptance period, or the acceptance process, and also being able to process tremendous grief, loss, trauma. And it is only secreted in tears, meaning that is a critical part of it. And again, we have that conditioning of being hard. Doesn't bother me. I'm fine. Get back to work. Allowing yourself to cry, right? And not just the brief, maybe on your way to work, then get yourself together, but to the degree that your body requires. And the cool thing is about that is your anatomy, physiology, and your psychology all communicate. You'll know when you're ready. You'll know when you're done. Trying to hinder that process. That's not how we do this. But, again, going back to the that original statement of not wanting to burden others. And, we all have responsibilities, whether it's work, family, school. We all have those responsibilities. And the reality is that grief often gets in the way of that.
Yeah.
And you and I both know that.
Yeah.
But, here's the thing is you can deal with it now, or you can not deal with it.
Right.
And then it never leaves you. It always stays with you. And this is where I think of the military a lot, is there is a centralized focus, particularly in the unit that I was in, and the requirements that were put on us physically and psychologically and emotionally is you are going to be hard. Strength, the term strong was measured only in physicality. Hardness, that was the psychological, the emotional aspect of you are unflinching no matter what happened. And the 22 suicides a day says that's not correct. Right.
Service suicides.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Service members leaving that environment, which that is the standard, that is the gold standard of hardness. You are not to do this. You are to complete your task, complete your mission, take care of those below you and above you. And that's why we have what we have. That's where the 22 a day, part of where the 22 a day comes from, is not allowing what is physiologically necessary to occur.
I remember it took a long time for me to cry and to feel, I suppose, safe enough to cry.
Right.
There was so much chaos, so much confusion, so much shock. There was just so much. And do you remember what you said to me when I did finally allow that breakdown?
What, the part that sounded like a wounded animal? Was
I
that
didn't mean to pop quiz
yeah.
you on
Yeah.
Yeah, that it was that raw, that that raw, that powerful, that painful, that overdue.
Yes. I think overdue is probably the most accurate word of all of that. And again, for the exact same reasons that we're talking about. And like I said, it's not necessarily gender specific. I mean, you are you're my example of that. Is based on your lifestyle, your career choice, your rearing. It's the same exact thing of not allowing that utterly necessary tool.
Yeah.
To be used.
I had no idea. I really didn't. And, it's one of those things I think back to when I was first diagnosed, and I literally left the doctor's office after being told you have cancer and a lot of it. I went to Red Lobster and I had a glass of wine and poked at a cheddar biscuit. And then I went to work.
Yeah.
And I didn't call my sister or my mother or my brother because I knew that making that phone call, I would be crying. But those tears actually would not have been for me. Those tears would have been for them receiving that news and their fear and their concern and their sadness and trauma and shock. And, I knew what I was going through, and I could only amplify that for my mother. And because nobody wants to hear that about their child.
Certainly, right.
So, yeah, it was definitely long overdue.
It's interesting the timeline as you spoke, well, just now of, in fact, and as referenced earlier, is there is a difference with that, and that's part of the first stage of grief is shock or denial, right? And that references the sympathetic nervous system. That represents the fight or flight mechanism. When one is active, the other can't be, right? So it's no surprise, and I would say probably correct as it can be anyway, that, you can't access something like that. Like hearing that news, losing that family member, losing that pet, the finally, or even just finally getting out of that traumatic situation, whatever that is, that fight or flight response, that adrenaline response, that sympathetic nervous system response is still so active Don't expect that you're going to be able to access these things immediately, because you physiologically can't. And for you in particular, it was months.
Yeah, it was.
Literally, it's 2 or 3 months afterwards, and just because there was no slowing down.
Yeah.
It wasn't necessarily even that either of us were trying to ignore this. Oh, holy crap, this is bad. This is life altering. It's just there was no break.
Yeah.
So I suppose, for our listeners and for us in the future, and because again, something like that's going to happen again, not cancer, but,
trauma.
Right.
Loss.
We don't get to get out of that.
Yeah.
Recognizing and being emotionally astute enough to understand that there's probably going to be a period of time where I just simply can't. But when it is ready, is not ignoring it, not denying it, I think is probably the better word. Allow it to occur. But just as you said, that's kind of the trick, is it does require safety. Because without safety, that sympathetic nervous system response is still active. It's still going to keep going. That's where the aftermath process is. That's really where it begins. Once you are in a place, both physical or psychological and emotional, of I can access these critical elements of survival, of processing, of getting out from the hold of that trauma. And
not staying stuck in that fear and locking it all away, imprisoning it and yourself with it.
Absolutely right. Absolutely. It took me 2 decades to get to that place, literally 20 years. Because of that, there was no place of safety. Based on what I was doing, not just as a career, that had a large part of it, but also who I chose to associate with, who I chose to spend my time with, and who I chose to be as vulnerable as I felt I could be, I suppose, around these people who were not my people. So 20 years, 20 years that I'm not going to get back, 20 years that could have made a considerable difference, and think about that as far as listeners, right? How much time have you spent with the people who won't allow this, who won't allow you to get through what you need to get through, to get out from under that trauma? That's where I was stuck for 2 decades in the first trauma, let alone the suitcase full of traumas within that 20 years,
It's amazingly powerful and liberating when you can make your way through it. And it's such a dark place when you're stuck in the middle of it.
Yes, it is. Yes, it is both. Yes. 20 years of being in that dark place, not being able to trust myself, not having faith in myself that I could even make good decisions based on that. And then coming out of that and realizing I'm an entirely different person. I'm a trustworthy guy. I'm okay, right? I'm a pretty cool guy to be around.
I think so.
Right? Yeah. And that's the thing, before I switched that focus from being hard to being strong, I wasn't. And nobody can be. That's the thing. I'm not saying that anyone, that everyone, or really anyone that, does just kind of straight and narrow this, just keep cutting type thing, you are obviously not bad people. Maybe you are. I don't know.
No.
If you're listening to this, you're probably not.
No.
But there is so much more that is available to you. And it just is. The ability to transcend fear, despair, to not have to be afraid of the next trauma, to have that complete and utter confidence in yourself that it doesn't matter what happens. I know I can manage this.
Yeah.
And imparting that to the people that matter to you. That's the payoff here. That's, to me in particular, being that source of strength to you, to the family, to people who rely on me, to people who I'm responsible for, the few people that I do let in, to be that person to them, because now I can. That's the point. That's why it is worth it. That's why it's necessary.
You and I have talked a lot, and we'll probably cover this in another podcast, either a solo or together, but that power of vulnerability, and when framed in this way, when you're thinking of hard versus strength, and how I know for me, and I can only speak for myself, that there is, when you have so much fear and you are protecting yourself through the hardness, there's so much fragility there. Yeah. That it's easy to kind of shatter with words that someone says to you, with, you make a mistake that you don't normally make, because there is so much stress and pressure, and cancer is like a second job, if not like a second job and a half. And giving yourself grace and allowing yourself through that is so critical, and finding strength in vulnerability.
Correct. And exactly what you said is that those seemingly inconsequential interactions or reactions leaving you shattered. And again, that result of hardness, not accessing, not allowing access, not seeking out these processes that are critical, they're mandatory. Glass is a good example. Glass is extremely hard. Try to cut glass. There's one thing that can cut glass: diamonds, right? Mm-hmm. Tap on it and it'll shatter.
It shatters. I can think back to many examples in the last 5 years for me where I had bolstered up my strength, thinking that I'm bolstering strength, and not necessarily recognizing that it was just that hard facade that was so fragile.
Right.
And it's to your point, you don't want to be. We're not passing judgment on anyone, and we're 5 years into this and still figuring it out. So it's not it's not like there's a get it figured out fast track. But speaking of that, what is your proof that it worked? And do you have any tips or tools that you would want to share with folks to help them start to find that path to strength if they are maybe self-recognizing that they're in the space of hard?
Sure. Well, the immediate proof is you and me. What we've gone through, what we've endured in the past 5 years, destroys not just relationships, but people. Destroys people. Yeah. To the point of not being recoverable. So going down the chemical addiction, the psychological addiction, not being able to get out of it. Well, that would be an example of trying to be hard, right? That immediate quench of the crucible. Now just 5 years into it, just 5 years, knowing and having complete faith in our strength as a unit because of our strength individually. It's there's no question to me, and I don't think there's really much question for you either, that it doesn't matter what is going to occur. We know that together we are strong enough to handle this. I could give you certainly other personal examples from earlier in life, and the impacts that those things have made. The seeming inability to make good choices, again, was a result of fragility, of trying to quench.
And it's amazing how in the middle of it, it actually feels safe. It feels strong.
Right.
It feels like the right answer. And even though, and possibly because it's numbing, right? It's control. It's all of those things that we are kind of raised with as our norms and our bellwethers of success.
Right. Absolutely. Absolutely. And back to success, not just my definition of success, but I think it's relatively widespread when we look at the core of success, and that is creating something that can't be taken from you. Money can be taken from you, and I have stories of that. We both do, right? Property, belongings, those can all be taken from you in so many different ways. The strength that I have accrued, the strength that you have accrued, and that we have accrued together cannot be. The confidence that strength breathes into us cannot be. Not saying that, there's nothing that can harm us. That's certainly not it. We're both, it's still life. There's still going to be pain and trauma and fear and doubt, but knowing that at the root of any one of those issues is the confidence that whether on our own or in particular through each other, there is nothing that we can't see through to the end. That is success. That is the ability to look anything in life directly in the eye and say, try me.
But don't try us.
But don't go to the other person.
We're good.
we seem like we've kind of filled our tank on that a little bit.
I'm good for a few years.
Right.
So, before I close this out, is there anything else that you want to add as our first show and flow together? This is, it's feeling good.
Yeah, it is. It is. I don't know. I guess in just kind of some closing points is, I would say it's important, if not critical, to remember that the reason why this is not the obvious and easy answer is because it is not easy. It is the hardest thing that a human being can be asked to do is to sit and accept those terrifying and brutal feelings of sadness, desolation, fear, horror, injustice, unfairness, cruelty, to sit in those, to not run, but to face them head on, wash over you, allow them to do that, and allow what is in each and every one of you, physiologically in each and every single person watching this, to do its job. Stop helping. Let it do its job. That, I would say, that's the beginning. Everything else is in many cases on an individual basis. I can tell you my personal tools for that. Probably another episode, but that doesn't mean they're going to be the same for you. Or even you. And in fact, we know that, you and I approach things quite differently in some cases, but ultimately it's the same beginning of the process is letting those feelings, those terrifying emotions, let them speak. That's how you begin.
Terrifying and powerful.
Yes.
So I know you and I have, for an upcoming episode, we're going to be talking stress management and stress.
Right.
But that'll be coming up. We had some of that.
Yep.
So proud of those gray hairs I gave you in your goatee.
Yeah.
It's good stuff.
Yeah.
So, but I want to thank you all so much for listening to episode 2 and giving us your time. And we just appreciate you so much. And we hope that in some way this was helpful. And we hope that you'll be back and join us for episode 3. Episode 3, I am going to be talking about medical advocacy, which is an ongoing thing. Oh, my goodness. From the moment you are diagnosed and even until now, I have sort of hinted at it. I've not hinted at it. I have flat out called it out on the Facebook page, the Your Killer Life Facebook page, the Your Killer Life Instagram, and also, we're going to be talking about it and calling it out here, both on the podcast and on the video podcast on YouTube. If you haven't subscribed, please give us a subscribe. That way you get the little bell that tells you there's an update on the YouTube or we're on your phone. And we're also going to be bringing in some great guests. So future episodes are going to cover some interviews with survivors. I have an amazing person who's coming on who's a man who's had breast cancer. A lot of people don't know that there is a fair number of men who are diagnosed with breast cancer and that they go through very similar treatments. And so going to be talking about that. So we've got a lot of good stuff coming up, and we want to thank you for allowing us to be here, be with you, be vulnerable with you. And thank you for listening. And I guess until next time, keep building your killer life.